share my screen for you guys there again. So I hope you can see that okay. But yeah, lovely to meet you all. My name is Laura Griffin. So I completed my PhD in wildlife ecology and behavior in UCG, which is how I actually know Kieran originally. And I'd like to thank him and Green Foundation Ireland for having me today. I have been based in Canada for the last couple of years doing my research fellowship in the University of British Columbia, looking at the human effects of harvesting activity. But today we're going to be running through a talk on human coexistence with wildlife across spaces, ecosystems, and sectors. So the goal of this talk today is to create a space for us to think about what defines human space and what defines wildlife space, and what actions we can take both as individuals, but also at the policy and government level to try and better conserve wildlife. So at the end of this, we'll have a nice open discussion, and I think that we'll probably all agree that a better title for this talk might be Animals Are All Around Us anyway, so how can we cohabit with them better? But before we can get to that, we have to talk about what I actually mean by space for wildlife. And going even deeper than that, why we need to consider space for wildlife. Why is it that we need to start thinking about making sure that there is space for wildlife? And that all ties back into biodiversity declines. So in today's day and age, as we're all well aware, biodiversity and wildlife populations are in severe decline. We are in a mass extinction event, and this is happening because of a variety of different factors, including climate change, not just warming temperatures themselves, but the knock-on effects that has on ecosystems through fires, flooding, desertification. Also overexploitation, both in terms of the removal of wildlife themselves from habitats, but also resource extraction. Invasive species, that being wildlife, but also insects and plants and the diseases that they bring into those areas and push out native wildlife. Pollution, and by that I mean both hard pollution in the form of rubbish, and then also pollution in terms of CO2, greenhouse gases, and pollution in waterways. And also a final factor that we hear a lot about in relation to biodiversity loss is habitat loss, no longer having those perfect ecosystems and habitats for these species to thrive, particularly if they're reliant on a very niche habitat. Now, one thing that ties all of these factors that impact biodiversity loss together is that they're either directly caused or at least influenced and accelerated by humans. That could be through population growth, our own increased consumption of resources, and also at the same time, reduced resource efficiency. Whatever medium it be through, it's undeniable that humans are accelerating biodiversity loss through these factors. However, there is hope, because it's generally agreed upon that somewhere in the intersection between government policy and legislation, science and research, and public participation, there is effective actions that we can take that could not only slow this severe downward trajectory of biodiversity loss, but even lead to biodiversity recovery. And some studies have even suggested that we could reach high levels of recovery by 2050. Some say that that might be a bit optimistic, but in general, it's agreed that there are actions that we can take to try and help conserve and preserve our species, not just in our own back gardens, but at the global scale. Now, how have we approached trying to do this? Well, initially we kind of sat back and said, okay, well, let's assign spaces to wildlife, particularly focused on wildlife conservation. What habitats are we destroying that species are particularly reliant upon? And can we turn those into special areas of conservation or special protected areas? Can we build up national parks based on what species need to set up kind of refugia for them? Or could we have regulated green spaces and wildlife reserves? All of these areas where wildlife and ecosystems, plant species, are the priority. And then the rest of the space can be focused on prioritizing humans. So those being urban areas, peri and semi-urban areas, industrial zones, or green spaces where human activities are the priority, such as farmlands or agricultural areas. So First, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this is extremely important in the world of wildlife conservation. Special areas of conservation do form really important refuges for species that are very sensitive to disturbance and are very reliant on niche habitat. However, it really is not as simple as breaking the planet up into space for wildlife and space for people. And we're well aware of that because if you think about human environments, let's start with the most human environment you can possibly think of, that being urban areas. So cities and townships. We know that there are lots of species that actually thrive within these environments. You can think of really popular examples, like I've been in Canada the last couple of years. You see raccoons and coyotes in all the major cities. In Ireland, like Dublin, Cork, other major cities, there's a really thriving urban fox population. And in cities across Asia and Africa, you hear about primate species such as macaques that do really well in urban environments. But it's not just these very adaptive, bold species. You do encounter shyer prey or general shy predator species thriving within these environments, or at least utilizing them. There's in many major cities, there's thriving deer populations, and you'll occasionally hear of sightings of other shire species, for example, cougars in North America. And in other countries as well, there's lots of stories coming out about wildlife accessing townships and villages. For example, in Africa, hyenas and lion populations will sometimes enter these areas, which accelerates conflict. But generally, these areas that could traditionally be thought of as human areas are shared with wildlife. We just sometimes don't register that they're there. And if we think about other human hubs, let's break it down even further. Let's just think about houses and sheds. These can be important refuges for wildlife. Like it's very common for people to realize that sheds or abandoned houses or even attics within actively used houses have become roosts for bats, or that there's swallows nesting within those eaves. And even within our gardens, such as like hedgerows, we know that that's important habitat for many native bird species. If we think about something that we often think of as being negative for wildlife, it's roads. Roads are very human dominated, and we'd be concerned about collisions as, being a bad thing for wildlife. But we know that there are lots of wildlife species that actively use these. Like in Canada, we were warned to be careful during the winter using roads because moose had actually started to use them as a source of salt. They'd lick the grit off the road during the winter when they didn't have access to salt in other areas. And there's lots of studies coming out that show that wolves actually actively use roads and other human linear features to move quicker from one area to another within their territories. This also goes in the other direction, which is that a lot of prey species will locate themselves close to human hubs of activity as a form of human shield to avoid being predated by large predators. So really, once again, not just in cities, but in other areas, we're sharing that space with wildlife, even if we don't realize it. And this happens not just in what am I saying? Sorry, this happens not just on land, but also in aquatic and marine environments. Like if you think about our local harbors, you hear many stories about boats being used by seals or walruses as a form of banking. You also hear about them approaching boats looking for fish or food to be thrown to them. And within many harbors, there are slowdown laws and legislation because harbors are actively used by cetacean species. Outside of marine environments, freshwater habitats like rivers and canals form really important waterway systems for a variety of species while still being actively used by humans. So these areas that we think of as human areas are also wildlife areas. And wildlife areas are also used by humans. We know that it's very important from a mental health perspective for humans to active green space action. So to go in for recreational activities in green spaces. We know that in national parks, hiking and camping are extremely popular activities. And often when people access these areas, they go in with the intention or at least the hope of seeing wildlife or photographing wildlife. In fact, there's an entire industry based around bringing people to areas to see wildlife. Think about going abroad on safaris. This is important because this generates revenue that then can go back into anti-poaching or better conservation program planning to help conserve those species. So even within what might be considered to be a wildlife area, humans are present too. I'd also like to go in with the caveat that these two things represent extremes in what land use is like across the planet. Really, a huge amount of the space worldwide that we have is green space that wildlife actively use and forms important habitats for them, but isn't protected. Humans are also using it, for example, resource extraction through logging and harvesting. In Ireland, there's a lot of conversation about bogs and peat milling activities. And then in other areas, there's also other forms of resource extraction, such as mining or oil fracking. Even beyond the scope of resource extraction, there are areas that wildlife use where humans are also present and it's unprotected. We can think about loads of wildlife documentaries talk about areas that form important nesting, breeding, or migration habitats, but aren't necessarily covered or protected by any legislation. So humans and wildlife are coexisting within these spaces. So yeah, what I'm trying to get at is that this traditional approach of, okay, we'll set this aside for wildlife and then we'll use this, doesn't really make sense. In reality, there's areas where wildlife are prioritized, but humans are present. Areas where humans are quite dense or active, but wildlife are also present. And this whole spectrum in between. Really, we need to remember that we're not separate from these ecosystems or these food webs. We've been part of them since time immemorial. Like, we are part of these food webs. What has happened in today's day and age is that we've pushed them into unnatural states. And it's really our responsibility to take action, both at the individual, but also at the policy and government level, to try and conserve wildlife and reduce and backtrack on the damage that we've done to them. So moving forward, how could we potentially do that? I thought it would be best to start with talking about individual actions here, because I think anyone who's logged into this talk today has done so because they have not just an interest, but a passion in wildlife and trying to do whatever they can to help conserve and protect our wildlife species. But might have the question of how we can do that as just people living our normal lives day to day. So I'll run through a few examples. A lot of them will be familiar, and there might be a few that you do yourself that I won't touch upon, and I really encourage you to save those for the end so that we can have a discussion around them. But hopefully you'll take some new actions away that you can apply to your day-to-day. So let's start with just at home. So if you're lucky enough to have a garden or access to a green space, I think Ireland has been really great at bringing in no-mow incentives. But throughout the year, it is excellent to leave patches of no-mow in our lawns. This allows pollinators to utilize these areas, but also mammals and smaller mammals in particular, like rodents, to have good coverage. Following on from that, placing flower bombs and flower patches is also a great way to benefit pollinators and mammals in our area, but be sure that you are using flower bombs that have native flowers in particular in them. Some of the ones that are advertised have exotic flowers. Another thing is to encourage hedge growth within your areas. This forms very important habitat for native birds to nest and breed in. If we think about water access and making a pond, this is something that anyone can do within any space. It doesn't have to be very large, and there's a lot of great guides online on how we can build ponds in our back garden. They could provide access to water, particularly during the summer months for many species, but also can form important spawning habitat for declining frog populations. And there's great guides as to how to make one that has enough coverage and a proper setup that frogs will utilize it. It's also important that we are aware of the spaces that are around our houses and apartments. And if we see wildlife trails, that we leave them, because we want to make sure that the animals are actively using that environment without being disturbed. With that in mind, how can we encourage wildlife to our areas? Well, we can set up shelters such as hedgehog houses or bird houses, but there's also actions that we can take at home that help animals abroad. We live in an age of rapid consumerism, and it's quite common to have, the idea of getting the new iPhone or a new laptop pushed on you. However, producing these different products requires a lot of mining abroad for metallic ores, which eat into habitat for our species present within those countries. So for example, this picture is mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, specifically for metal ores for our phones. And this eats into habitat for endangered mountain gorilla species. So by reducing our own consumption at home of products like this, we can reduce demand, which also prevents these from becoming more widespread. On the subject of other activities we can take at home that might have more, for want of a better word, global impacts, I think we're very conscious about trying to reduce our carbon footprints, for example, by taking the bus or cycling instead of driving. We can also try to see if we can grow fruit and vegetables at home or only source food from local buyers and farms. At least that way we're reducing the amount of emissions that are produced through wide-scale shipping. But I do want to acknowledge that there is a cost of living crisis, and this is not an accessible option for everyone. Another thing on the flip side of that is to be mindful of your food waste and of your rubbish and make sure that animals can't access it. Following on from that we're not intentionally feeding wildlife in our gardens and never hand feeding, because we want them to learn natural foraging behaviors and not become dependent on us, and also not be eating food that's inappropriate for them. Thinking about roads again, as someone whose family is from Kerry, we have to be very cautious at certain times of the year, for example, during fawning season, to make sure that we're not going to impact young fawns and their mothers crossing the road. It's just something to think about while driving, that we always have to be aware that wildlife are using these spaces and making crossings too. And in the unfortunate case where you do come in contact with roadkill, whether it be previously present or not, if it is safe, it's a great thing to pull in and try and move it from the road. That prevents scavengers from being hit as a knock-on effect. So that's a small action we can take to try and reduce the amount of roadkill on our local roads. Thinking about our gardens again, if you want to put something like fencing in place, and there's certain species that you know use your space, we can make decisions to make that fencing more appropriate for wildlife transit. So if you know that hedgehogs utilize your habitat or foxes, you can insert fencing that has access points for them, so they're not being fenced out from their areas and you're not breaking the connectivity of their habitat. Another thing is that with birds, if you happen to be in a flight path, high impact to windows is a major cause of mortality within a lot of native bird species, and there's steps we can take, such as putting up stickers or markers on our windows to reduce these local mortalities, which can benefit the local populations a lot more substantially than one might think. If we move upscale a little bit, if you live in a home that happens to have a larger landed area or you're on a farm, particularly if you're on a farm, there's a lot of steps that you can take to promote native bird population occurrence. So for example, if you're on arable land, you can retain winter stubble or consider planting a wild bird cover crop. You can also plant, establish, or conserve your native hedgerows and trees, as they're important bird habitat and also very key movement habitat for a lot of mammal species, such as foxes, badgers, rabbits, and hares. And you can also encourage wildflower growth around the farm. This is really, really key for pollinators. And if you want to take it a step further, you could even potentially consider beekeeping. There's a lot of courses that are exploding across Ireland at the moment in terms of popularity, where people can learn to beekeep. And not only then do you potentially get honey from your own bees, but you're promoting pollinators within your own land. There's also a series of grants, and I won't go into too much depth with this because I'm sure people are aware of them, but there's a lot of grant-based projects that are constantly being promoted and overturned in Ireland, such as currently the Owl-Box program to try and set up more barn owl nesting habitat on farms, and the Freshwater Channel Preservation Grant. Now, I won't go into these in too much depth, but I will refer back to Teagasc as being the main authority to refer to for this, and there are handbooks available on their website if you want to look at these in more detail. Okay, let's step further out again. We've talked about the home, we've talked about your home if you're on a larger landed area. Now let's think about if you're visiting your local and national park. How can you help wildlife within those areas? Well, the ultimate goal of any park is to preserve its local biodiversity and even promote it even more to attract more wildlife. And there are actions we can take in these areas to try and help with that. So a lot of these parks do have volunteer programs to try and help with local wildlife occurrence. This may include volunteering your time to help with surveys. For example, Birdwatch Ireland do a lot of surveys if you're into birding, but you can also do local reptile surveys with Herpetology Ireland. And there's also usually volunteer programs to work with invasive species management. For example, rhododendron management and removal is very common across a lot of parks now, particularly around the Southwest, and can be a great way to try and help return native habitat. What else can we do? Again, a lot of us are going to these parks because we want to see our native wildlife, but I again emphasize that we should see them, but not try and approach them or feed them in any way. It's also important that we stay on designated trails. This is important because sometimes if we move off of those trails or try and shortcut or access other areas, we can damage delicate vegetation that species are reliant upon. And also often trails are placed in a certain way to allow areas of refuge for shyer species to stay in so they can avoid human active areas. And we don't want to cut into those and disturb those wildlife. And also building out from this again, there is a number of citizen science projects occurring at any time, often app-based if you have a smartphone, where you can track the wildlife that you encounter when you're in national parks, local parks, or just in a walk in general. A lot of the time, the information from these apps gets fed back to larger studies. If you're into birding, Merlin is an excellent app. I know in Ireland sometimes there's other projects that happen. Smart Deer, for example, was a project that was running for a while that focused on deer occurrence across Ireland. This is a very good way to help just record what you've seen while you're out and about, and it can go back to doing really important biodiversity research. All right, now let's step out even further again. What are some actions that we can potentially take when we're abroad? I think most of us are aware of the fact that there's a lot of wildlife tourism that is unethical. We know that we shouldn't be going abroad and engaging in activities such as elephant riding or anything like that. But there's a lot of wildlife activities that we want to do, and it's important to just do the research to make sure that what you're doing is ethical. For example, if you go abroad and you want to partake in whale watching activities, if you have a look at their website, often local governments or local wildlife conservation groups will promote certain groups or have given them a badge or an award for performing ethical wildlife tourism, getting checked and assessed to make sure they always keep safe distances or that they turn off their engines effectively or minimize disturbance. Also groups that avoid direct contact feeding or touching wildlife, or even in some cases baiting, will sometimes be promoted by local authorities who want to encourage people to use that kind of wildlife tourism group. So doing a little bit of research ahead of time can help us avoid making mistakes, I guess is what I'm saying, because we want to be ethical, we want to be responsible, and arming ourselves with knowledge can allow us to do that. Following on with the idea of arming ourselves with knowledge, an important thing that we often don't think about is that when we're going abroad, it's good to check if we're going to be arriving during any key wildlife seasons, whether that be during a breeding season or during a hatching season or during a migration season. This can make sure that we make steps to avoid disturbing them. For example, we might not take a night walk on the beach if we realize that we're walking through a turtle hatching habitat during hatching time, because we don't want to disturb them with lights. When abroad as well, if you are a hiker or a camper, and I think this is pretty well known now, but it's worth re-emphasizing, it's important to be conscious of your food or anything that has a strong scent to avoid attracting predators who end up becoming nuisance animals. Out in Canada, we have a saying that a fed bear is a dead bear. And unfortunately, a lot of the time people are not leaving food in intentionally. It's just an accident, a mistake, and it ends up being detrimental both for human safety and for wildlife. And, you know, this is actually a good policy for us to apply at home in Ireland as well. While our safety might not be at risk because we don't have any large predators, it's still good to try and avoid it because we don't want to food habituate smaller species either, because they do become nuisances. It can be inappropriate for them, and we want to make sure that we're allowing them to forage naturally. And finally, on the subject of contact with wildlife, often particularly in the form of like food, but doing research ahead of time, it's really important to research any wildlife conflict issues that may occur in the area before you arrive there. For example, in Ethiopia, they have issues with baboons stealing food from people and stealing bags from people. And they have similar issues, for example, in Gibraltar with macaques. Being aware of these issues ahead of the time can make sure that you take steps to avoid exacerbating the issue. And in so doing so, you reduce the wildlife conflict within those areas. So really, knowledge is power, and just looking a few things up ahead of time can help us to be a lot more responsible when we're traveling. I'd like to finish off that idea of individual actions with the encouraging message that everything really does have a knock-on effect. Like sometimes we can take these actions at an individual level, and I've spoken to people who have said, yes, I'm doing it, but what's it really doing for the big picture? Ecosystems are all connected ultimately in a large web, and those small actions that we take do have knock-on and ripple effects. So we do have a lot of power, and it is an excellent thing to be able to do that to try and conserve and preserve our local wildlife species. But yes, of course, there is a ceiling to what we can achieve as individuals, because there are large-scale extractive activities, there's large corporations that are performing activities that not have impacts on wildlife. So I will move on to talking about some developments that have happened recently in regards to policies at a more national, international, and global scale, keeping in mind that our actions are important, but being aware of what's happening at a policy and global scale can also help us to put pressure on people to make more responsible ethical decisions or push through policies that are important for our local habitats. So moving back to those unprotected middle of the spectrum systems that I was talking about, they're an interesting area because while it might seem appealing to say, okay, why don't humans just pull out of these areas entirely? It would be better for wildlife. That's really not possible. Like a lot of our infrastructure is very reliant on natural habitats for building supplies, for food. For example, in a lot of developing nations, they're reliant on wild forests for food security. It's impossible for us to drop everything and just remove ourselves entirely from these areas. What we can do is be more responsible when we're within them. So it's important that governments and large corporations consider ways in which they can ensure that they're reducing the negative impacts that they have on wildlife while still gaining what humans need to be able to keep our systems functioning as they are, while pulling back from this point that we've reached in the Western world where we're actually over extracting, we're taking more than we need. At the moment, I work a lot within the world of forestry and harvesting and seeing how that's impacting wildlife. And there are steps that are being taken to try and make sure that we're balancing this a bit better. For example, replanting native forests when there is tree removal, consistently doing biodiversity surveys so we can detect a change as it happens and see how we can effectively introduce management to reduce the impacts or reintroduce those species to those areas, and research that looks at different ways in which we could perform harvesting activities with less of a negative impact. For example, different types of percentage removal, where instead of clear cutting an entire area, you're seeing whether you should remove a certain amount or a different age category and how that affects wildlife within that area and surrounding areas. So there is a lot of stuff being done, but policy is slow to change. It's just one of the realities of working within these spaces, and it's important that this research is emphasized, continued, and that corporations are invested within that change, because ultimately we do need to hit that balance between human needs, but minimizing impacts on wildlife, because we are sharing this space with them. Now, what about other activities? And here I'm specifically thinking about, for the moment, development. Well, the great news is that today there's a lot more emphasis being put on environmental impact assessment prior to any development. And by that, I mean the development and building of housing estates, of roads, of factories, and other forms of larger corporates. Nowadays, there really is not just an emphasis on assessing how it will impact wildlife, but also having biodiversity action plans put in place to mitigate those impacts. And this is really key. We need to make sure that ahead of time we know what the impacts are going to be and that we put steps in place to try and prevent them. In terms of areas that have already been disturbed, there is now a lot of emphasis and funding going towards rewilding and restoration projects to try and return them to what they would have liked prior to disturbance. One thing that we're familiar with through the news, for example, is the 30 by 30 framework, where Ireland, along with a lot of other nations, have committed to restoring 30% of our disturbed habitats to, for want of a better word, undisturbed state by 2030. It's initiatives like that that will keep us pushing forward and keep larger corporations and the government incentivized to preserve and conserve our environment. There's also invasive species management plans, there's reintroduction programs. We're working on a lot of things, but this comes on with something that's gaining a lot more attention now and a lot more conversation within the ecology world, which is that it's okay to conserve these areas and rewild these areas, but they're still broken up. If we think about that old school way of looking at, this is an area for wildlife, it's very broken up, and it means that wildlife can't move from area to area. So now more emphasis is being put on projects such as the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative in North America, where we're not just looking at protecting areas, but we're looking at making sure that the wildlife, and therefore their genes, can move from preserved area to preserved area, that there's ways that they're connected through wildlife corridors. So they're not just in these isolated islands. And that's really important for making sure that long-term species and populations are able to survive. And we can incorporate this kind of thing into development planning. So one very popular way of doing this on the global scale is through, for example, wildlife road crossings. Nowadays, if you're going to develop a road, you have to write this in some way, or at least in a lot of countries, it's emphasized that it should be considered. And retroactively, it's occurring on a lot of road systems that crossings are being applied, whether this be through a bridge. In some countries, for example, with high densities of forest and a lot of species that are canopy movers, it's through planting trees that touch at the top or have ropes for them to swing across. And in countries where there's endangered species that don't like to be exposed, also you can build tunnel systems underneath the road so that they can keep covered as they go under. It's not just the case in roads, that's just one example in terms of connectivity, but in environmental impact assessments, looking to see whether there's any active used trails within a site is also assessed to make sure that that's not going to be disturbed, or at least that there's going to be some sort of infrastructure put in place to encourage the wildlife to continue to use that area. If I can move away from development for a second and talk about research, we have had problems historically in research with what is termed parachute science. This would mean that researchers would enter an area because they want to be able to inform developers on what an issue is, perform their data collection, leave, do their science, publish their findings, but nothing actually changes because that information didn't make its way back to the local communities. They weren't actually being engaged with. Now there is an emphasis on trying to move away and avoid at all costs parachute science, and when entering an area to see what impacts are being had by certain developments or by certain activities, making sure that you engage local communities and arm them with knowledge and resources to be able to continue the project or improve things after the research is completed. All of this ties together into this concept of better proactive management of wildlife. Now, I put emphasis on the word proactive because historically at the policy level, we've been very reactive. And by that, I mean, we have applied an activity, whether that be development, whether it be extraction, have gone in and assessed what the impacts were. And if we found that something was being negatively impacted, we then applied management after the fact to try and compensate for what was happened. Active management relies on research and proper assessment being done ahead of time to make sure that management actions are put in place prior to the activity happening at all, which means that you're not trying to retroactively fix things, you're making sure that the effects are minimized from the beginning. And this is really the direction that we need to head in, and what we need to put pressure on different groups to consider. And ultimately fund as a form of research, because figuring out how something has been impacted means that we can make sure it doesn't happen again in another area. So what are the key takeaways from this altogether? Essentially, we share all of our space with wildlife. Every part of this planet, we share it with wildlife. And it's our job to acknowledge that, and not just that, but take applied actions to better coexist with them. Whether those actions be at the individual or the policy and governmental level, it's all part of the web that we're interconnected in order to try and help preserve and conserve wildlife. And those things, any actions that's taken does have knock-on impacts. And it's important that the policies that are being developed be proactive, so that we're actively making sure that we're not impacting these species as we enter these areas. So with that, I would like to thank Green Foundation Ireland again for having me, and I'm very excited to hear if any of you have any questions whatsoever. We can open a discussion and a discourse about, how everyone feels about all of this, or any actions that you're taking to try and better help the wildlife within your own area. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very, very much, Laura. That was fascinating. I was taking notes, which is always a really good sign during one of these talks. So thanks a million for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording now. So this will be available for anybody who wants to look through it again. I might do that myself because I know there's a few things. I'm writing down so much, but you said so many things. I'll need to look at it again at some stage. So it'll be available on our YouTube in the coming weeks. But I'll stop recording now so that we can ask any questions that we feel that we're interested in. So.